Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. This is a conference on Paine and the state, and it's marvelous that we launched this conference with such an insightful paper as that of Professor Speck, one which I'm afraid is going to focus much more clearly on the theme of this conference than my own talk. But Professor Speck put his finger on it, I think, in one of his remarks where he points out how seldom Paine used the term the state. And it may be that the state is a rather abstract generalization which came into use after the intellectual world in which Paine, I contend, operated. He imagined that he lived in a world of kingdoms and republics, and that these two were importantly different, rather than being subsumed in a common identity, the state. So I'm extremely grateful to Professor Speck for all the insights in his paper, and also for his extremely kind opening remarks, which flattered me too much. It's a great privilege to address this body. It's always encouraging to be in a society of people who share a common interest, but it's much more than that, to be in a body that shares an interest in such an astonishing and inspiring figure as Thomas Paine. This gives me a great sense of excitement, and I thank you, therefore, for this invitation. Paine was and is an inspirational figure. Bill Speck asked me if I wanted to project something onto the board. I said, no, I have an exhibit which will prove my point. Last Christmas, my wife and I had a house guest who brought along as a housewarming present a tea towel. This is it. I don't know how many of you have this tea towel. You should all have it. It's produced by a company called RadicalTeaTowel.com, and you will all recognize the figure emblazoned upon it. Note, please, the legend that is inscribed on it, a quotation from Paine that you all know. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. And if you wanted a one-sentence summary of Paine's peculiar fascination and excitement and inspirational quality, we could do worse than choose that sentence. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. And especially, I think, since the 1960s, that has been a leading ideal on both sides of the Atlantic, but especially in the United States, where I live and work for much of the year. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. But of course, as an historian, I have to point out that that is not possible. We do not have it in our power to begin the world over again. We cannot wipe the slate clean. We all of us have baggage. We are who we are. And it is because we are who we are, because we cannot escape our baggage, that that ideal is so attractive to us all. What is the historian's reply to this? The historian's reply is that we need, as historians, to discern the historical formation which created Thomas Paine, rather than simply picking up that invocation and running with it. We need to know what Thomas Paine's baggage was. What's the alternative view? The alternative view is something you're very familiar with. It's the notion of Paine as the prophet of modernity, a completely different order of affairs. And this debate is now opening up, I think, as one between two notions. The first notion has been called universalism. The second notion, I don't think I coined the word, I borrow the word particularism, to counter universalism. What then is universalism? If you look at Jonathan Israel's great books, huge books on the Enlightenment, you will find an impassioned defense of universalism. The notion, in other words, that the Enlightenment embodied ideals and practices which were true for everyone, everywhere. It was, therefore, the most important episode in world history. He's quite frank about this. It is the most important episode. And my reply to that notion of the Enlightenment, and I set up a panel with Jonathan Israel on the panel at the ISEX conference in Rotterdam, was it last summer, in which I was able to say to him, what a wonderful world we would live in if only there had been, in the 18th century, that sort of widespread, shared movement, international movement of social and political reform that the historians describe to us in such eloquent terms. What a wonderful world we would live in. But in fact, what sort of world do we live in? Open your morning newspapers. What do they declare to you? They declare to you a world full of war, suffering, disease, tyranny, genocide, iniquity. The Enlightenment then is an aspiration and not a secure possession. My conclusion is that we need to look at the late 18th century as an era in which two things are happening. Firstly, that people like Thomas Paine are indeed making universalist invocations, assertions of memorable kind. The other thing that's happening is that those universalist aspirations were and have been extremely difficult to translate into practical achievements, precisely because we are who we are. We have this particularist baggage. And I'm interested both in Paine as a universalist, giving expression to these inspiring generalizations, and also I'm interested as an historian in the way in which even Thomas Paine found it very difficult to transcend his identity. Here's another one. Renaissance self-fashioning. We all invent ourselves. You can choose precisely who you are and who you want to be. I don't believe a word of it. I think people are themselves, and they tend to be remarkably themselves over many decades. We are not free to wipe the slate clean. It is difficult to deliver good things in human affairs by government action. And this bears on the general scenarios that we entertain about many of the larger themes in Tom Paine's lifetime. And I said that I would talk briefly in this presentation about a number of themes. One of them, of course, is human rights. And the long-term scenario of human rights that we entertain in our minds and into which we fit historical characters like Thomas Paine. The conventional story, I think, is embodied in a brilliant book by a great historian whom I greatly admire, Lynn Hunt. In 2007, she published a book entitled Inventing Human Rights. And there she told a story, an idealistic, uplifting story, of the long-term scenario of the development of natural rights claims. She began, and this is no secret, it's not original, I think, but the skill with which she established this scenario is, I think, original and convincing and powerful. We begin in the 17th century with rights conceived of as particularist legal entitlements, rights as privileges delivered to you by the legal system in which you live. We end with universal human rights. We go through the 18th century when there were, according to Lynn Hunt, deep changes in human sensibility. Human rights were devised and generalized into universal human rights. 1776 and 1789 are to be interpreted within that scenario. 1789 in particular is the transcendent achievement of this development of human rights. It is a splendid story in Lynn Hunt's vision. But we get to the 1790s, and then what? Then what happens? In Lynn Hunt's book, she says, well, there's a problem there, because after the 1790s, there is what she calls, and I quote her, a long gap until the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Well, what happens in that long gap? It is rather a long gap, about a century and a half, which is full of, I would say, iniquity and human suffering, war, genocide, tyranny, outrage, not declarative, in my view, of any widespread or deep-rooted respect for the universality of human rights. You're all familiar with das Adam Smith problem. Let me give you a new problem. The new problem I call das long gap problem. It is a problem indeed, and I'm questioning now the conventional story of the long-term development of human rights theory, and I want to use that questioning to relocate Thomas Paine within it. So what I have to say this morning, in very brief terms, and I'm painting with the broadest of broad brushes, if you will forgive me, I want, in the first part of my remarks, to talk about Paine as an Englishman with English baggage. And secondly, I want to follow up that analysis by making some very general, even more general points about how that reinterpretation bears on what we still imagine to be the new world of politics after 1776 and after 1789. What are the implications of all this in the long term? That's part two. So in part one, I want to talk about Paine the Englishman, Paine the man of his time, Paine as somebody who is not indeed a prophet of future politics. Indeed, I want to argue, can there be prophets of the future? Well, we've just lived through an economic crisis which was certainly not predicted by the world's greatest economists. And whether you're an economist or a politician, you seem not to possess a crystal ball. Did Paine possess a more transparent crystal ball than anyone else? I doubt it. I suggest there cannot be prophets. There can only be prophets if we can identify within human affairs processes. And if you open any historical book, you will find that the author, and I blame myself, will fall into the trap of talking about processes. I now question whether there are such processes in human affairs. A process is something that happens in the physical world around us. We transfer the word process as a metaphor to human affairs. All arguments from metaphor look strong until you realize that they're only an argument from metaphor. I then begin to inquire whether Thomas Paine himself had any such notion as the notion of social process, and I cannot find it. Paine was innocent of so many things that we take for granted. He was innocent of the conceptual vocabulary that we use, radicalism, socialism, conservatism. He was innocent of many of the, he was innocent of these ideologies. He was also innocent of many of the categories that we use. He didn't talk about emotions, for example. Lynn Hunt's book is all about how the 18th century became extremely emotional because it read all these novels, and the novels encouraged people to respect the sanctity of the individual and the integrity of the body of other individuals so that they ceased to practice torture and so forth. People in the 18th century did not talk about emotions, they talked about the passions, and that is very different. They didn't talk about process. They didn't talk about modernity. They didn't talk about progress in our terms. They thought differently. They didn't talk about nostalgia. If monarchists were monarchists, they weren't monarchists because they were nostalgic about monarchy. They didn't think in terms of nostalgia. They sometimes had words that appear to us to be like the words we use, like class, but then they meant something different by those words. So the study of Thomas Paine is fascinating for me, not because I'm a follower of Thomas Paine, I'm neither for nor against Thomas Paine, but because Thomas Paine poses to me a series of historical problems of enormous importance and complexity. When I was a teenager, when I was a student, And indeed, for a very long time, I was brought up reading Thomas Paine. I had the Penguin editions. I thought, here is a man with a brilliant prose style. All I need to do is pick up the text and read them, and I will understand what he's saying. I no longer believe that to be true. I believe Paine to be as difficult to understand as any 18th century author. It is a long time ago. They were different people. And that is why I want to suggest that in the second half of my talk, the undoubted changes wrought by the American and the French revolutions did not in any simple sense represent the triumph of something that the pioneers of the Enlightenment fought for. That's not how we can conceive it now. So Paine is an Englishman. What sorts of things, I'm not going to go through in detail, but I'm going to focus on 2 or 3 areas. And I'm going to ask, what can we do in this sort of area if we start looking at Paine more historically? And of course, I stand here in the footsteps, I tread in the footsteps of Professor Speck, whose brilliant book, a political biography of Thomas Paine, I hope is owned by every member of this society. I hope you'll be queuing up for asking for his autograph afterwards, because he indeed has done something very similar to what I'm trying to do now. He in respect of Paine's political career, I in respect of Paine's political and social thinking. So what sorts of things can we do with Paine? Well, let me begin with the notion of anti-monarchical commitments in Paine. Professor Speck raised quite rightly the point, why on earth would Paine have spent so much time denouncing monarchy if monarchy were not a strong and powerful institution in the 18th century? And it's quite right, it was. But where did Paine's anti-monarchism come from? When I was a child reading the Penguin editions, this was not a problem that was ever posed. Obviously, monarchy was an old-fashioned institution, republics were modern, Paine was on the side of modernity. What's the problem? Why should we argue this? Well, if you know anything about ancient history, you will discover on day one that monarchies and republics are equally ancient in human history. If you know anything about the modern United States, you'll know that the US Republic has turned into an elective monarchy. If you know anything about the modern history of Russia, you will see that whatever you call Putin, it is effectively a monarchy. So it's not enough, I think, to say simply that monarchies belong to an old world, republics to a new world. Paine was the midwife of a new world. Therefore, he is obviously on the side of republics, obviously against monarchies. Where do Paine's, and indeed he isn't against all monarchs, he's against George III, he's not against Louis XVI. Paine does not give us a series of derogatory remarks about Louis XVI, which you might well expect him to do. He does give us a series of derogatory remarks about George III. Where does he get those from? If you look at Paine's Common Sense, look at the title page of the first edition, you will see there lines of verse attributed to Thomson. Who was Thomson? The political scientists who write about Thomas Paine today haven't the faintest idea who Thomson was, not the foggiest idea, or nor did I as a student when I read Common Sense. I knew everything that I have to say about conventional interpretations of Thomas Paine are self-criticisms of interpretations which I once held. They're not criticisms of anybody else, they're criticisms of me. I didn't know who Thomson was. Thomson, James Thomson, died 1748, didn't live into the age of the American or French revolutions. James Thomson was the poet laureate, effectively, of the patriot opposition to Sir Robert Walpole. Who was Sir Robert Walpole? The most corrupt politician in British politics ever, ever. He even beats our present-day profiteers. And the Walpolean regime, therefore, created by antithesis, by reaction, an opposition which was remarkably talented. The intelligentsia of the day combined forces to frame an ideological case against Robert Walpole. It wasn't entirely new, but then no political movement is entirely new. It was also, puzzlingly, a combination of what we would say is far left and far right. It was a combination of Tories shading into Jacobites, with opposition Whigs who are often religious freethinkers. What was Paine's indebtedness to this? Where did Paine get his images of George III from? Well, from a man called George Lewis Scott, mathematician, bureaucrat, friend of James Thompson. In 1750, George Lewis Scott was made sub-preceptor, instructor in other words, to the Prince of Wales, who later became George III. George Lewis Scott had a circle of friends, shall we say, of a particular cast of mind. People like David Mallet. David Mallet, friend of James Thompson. David Mallet, friend of Pope and of Bolingbroke. Incidentally, George Lewis Scott gets his job as sub-preceptor promoted by Lord Bolingbroke after he returns from France and is living in Battersea. Lord Bolingbroke, the total loose cannon of early 18th century politics, former Jacobite, could be Jacobite again if the wind changed, patron of freethinkers, religious skeptic himself, didn't publish the religious free thought in his lifetime. As Samuel Johnson said, he left half a crown to a beggarly Scotsman. He primed the gun and then left half a crown to a beggarly Scotsman to pull the trigger after Bolingbroke's death. In 1752-4, I think, the 5-volume quarto edition of Bolingbroke's works comes out, edited by Mallet, with all Bolingbroke's free-thinking material in it. Caused great shock and horror. George Lewis Scott, friend of Allan Ramsay, the Scot, man of letters, Jacobite, under the pen name Gavin Douglas, translates the Aeneid into Scots, and it's a storehouse of Jacobite imagery. Jacobitism is everywhere in the early 18th century. Not as romanticism, not as nostalgia, but as political ideology. And it finds allies not in the middle ground of politics, it finds allies on the other extreme of politics, among the freethinkers and quasi-republicans of the Patriot opposition to Sir Robert Walpole. Thomas Paine was not a Jacobite, he was an anti-Jacobite. But he travels a similar path to people like Jeremy Bentham and Edward Gibbon, both of whom are born into City of London Jacobite families. They tread a path through religious skepticism to religious unbelief. They tread a path from Jacobitism through dissociation from monarchy to frank skepticism, incredulity, and hostility to monarchy as such. That is a pathway that quite a number of people tread. Thomas Paine treads a similar pathway, not because he's a Jacobite, but because he is an anti-Jacobite. And English politics in the early 18th century is riven with ideological conflict and with personal and personally expressed hatred and contempt. Colonial America, by contrast, is tranquil. Americans are so polite. They sit around saying, have a nice day. Let's talk about natural rights theory. In England at the same time, people were at each other's throats because very many people thought that the first two Hanoverian monarchs were frauds. They were usurpers. They had established an illegitimate and corrupt regime by a palace coup in 1714. Out of that virulent anti-Hanoverian polemic comes Paine, who is actually a bit more polite. In London, when in the years before Paine goes to America, there is published a journal called The Crisis. The Crisis is a sustained, it's weekly, it's a sustained denunciation of George III's monarchy, by name. That journal is republished in colonial America by, for example, Robert Aitken, who is Paine's first publisher in Pennsylvania. And it is very influential there. Paine takes across the Atlantic an English discourse. If you look at Paine's Common Sense, look at the title page again, you see that the title page will identify Common Sense is composed of 4 parts, 4 sections. Read the first 2 sections. The first 2 sections say nothing whatever about colonial America. They say nothing whatever about the transatlantic controversy of the previous 10 years. They are all about England. They are all about the English monarchy. Make no reference at all to anything American. And my hunch, I cannot prove it, I do not assert it, I have no evidence, but my hunch is that those first 2 sections were either written or at least drafted by Paine before he left England, and he took them across the Atlantic with him, and then added to them sections 3 and 4, which are about the American crisis, and fused these sections together by his enormous journalistic skill into what we now imagine to be a unified pamphlet, Common Sense. Okay, so that's where he gets his anti-monarchism from. Let me give you another example of where we can learn some things about Paine the Englishman. What about anti-slavery? We all know, or used to know, that Paine is an anti-slavery activist. Why do we know this? Because in the Moncure Daniel Conway edition of Paine's collected works published in the 1890s, Conway printed an essay from the Pennsylvania Journal in March 1775 entitled African Slavery in America. And this has been republished in all the editions of Paine's collected writings ever since. And it denounces slavery, so it must have been by Paine. This is what Moncure Daniel Conway did. He was a great scholar. He did, as you all know, an enormous amount of good for Paine's scholarship. But he did some wrong things too. One of the wrong things he did was to look at the Philadelphia Press, go back to the original sources, look at the Philadelphia Press after Paine arrived and before Common Sense. He went through it. And whenever he found an article, an anonymous article, that seemed a bit like Paine, or was a great crusading article denouncing some iniquity, he said, aha, this must be by Thomas Paine, and he put it in his edition. This essay, African Slavery in America, is not by Paine. There is no evidence that links Paine with this essay. Subsequent editions of Paine's collected works have omitted the byline. You know, in the 18th century, newspapers were run on a shoestring. They couldn't afford journalistic staff. They would often reprint as their essays a piece sent in by the public. And this essay sent in by the public typically would have a byline saying, Mr. Editor, I've been a loyal reader of your journal for 20 years. Be pleased to print this article of mine and oblige your loyal servant, J.C., Jonathan Clark. Well, there was such a byline on this essay originally, and it says, Messrs. Bradford, please to insert the following and oblige yours, A.B. Not T.P., but A.B. This is Anthony Benezet, the Quaker anti-slavery publicist who has put his head above the parapet in Pennsylvania. Not many people do, and has written tract after tract after tract. He's a very intelligent man with a very wide range of reference. And in this essay, he lists his sources, his intellectual sources, a long, long list of people that Paine has never read. This is Anthony Benezet. So why did it look as if Paine was... so what did Paine think about slavery? Well, he's against it. And he's against it like most Englishmen of his time. He says it's against natural rights. All the English say this in the 1750s, 60s, 70s. They say, no, wait. If you asked him, he said, no, I'm against it. And there are, I think, 3 passages in private letters, in which Paine says, over many decades, I'm against slavery. But that was only in the sense in which we are all against things. We say, well, we're against climate change. but we don't do much about it. We still run our cars. We say, oh, well, I mean, it's only one car that I drive. It can't do much damage. And I really need to get to the distinguished meeting of the Paine Society, so I shall let myself off this one time. So that's typical. That's one attitude, which is very, very English. When Paine gets to America, there is an anti-slavery society in Philadelphia. There is no evidence that Paine joins this anti-slavery society. This anti-slavery society is suspended during the American Revolutionary War. It's then re-established in Pennsylvania after the war, and again there is no evidence that Paine joins it, until in April 1787, on the 23rd of April 1787, this society elects 36 new eminent members, all the great and the good, including Thomas Paine. But the biographers of Paine, I think, have not typically noticed that on the day when this happens, 23rd of April 1787, Paine has already left Philadelphia to go to New York to catch the boat to France, because the packet port has been changed to New York. So he's left. He's not on the spot when he's elected to the society. He never, ever gives any evidence that he agrees to be a member of this society. He writes to people like Benjamin Franklin, who I believe is elected president. He is elected president of this refounded society. Franklin and Paine never refer to it. So what I think happens is that this society tries to raise its profile by electing 36 famous men and saying, we're making you a member of the honorary member of the Thomas Paine Society. Do you agree? I would say, naturally, thank you so much for the honor. I naturally agree. But I'd never before been a pro-Paine campaigner. So Paine gets to France. There is a French anti-slavery society, has its first meeting in Paris on the 19th of February, 1788. And Paine is backwards and forwards in England, and then he's permanently in France after 1792. There is no record of Paine ever being a member of that society until there's an entry in the society's journals for the 30th of March, 1799, when a Monsieur Paine, P-A-I-N, is elected to membership. Is that the Englishman Thomas Paine? There is no evidence that this is the Englishman Thomas Paine. So when I was last in Paris, I looked up the surname Paine in the Paris telephone directory. And of course, there are lots and lots and lots of French men and women surnamed Paine. It's a common French surname. There's no evidence that Paine ever joined it. What about in England? There's an English anti-slavery society. Its minute books are in the British Library. The minute books, in detail, and I've gone through them, give no record whatsoever that Paine ever joined that society. There was a published list of members. Paine is not in the published list of members. Paine, in the published list of members and in the minute books of the society, there are many, many, many names of figures whom Paine is in regular contact with, both English and French. Paine is not there. Thomas Clarkson, the anti-slavery activist, when the anti-slavery bill goes through the House of Commons in 1807, Clarkson publishes in 1808 a 2-volume detailed history of the anti-slavery movement on both sides of the Atlantic, listing the activists and the pioneers and giving them praise for all they've achieved. Paine isn't mentioned. Paine is not there. Paine, similarly, if slavery and imperialism go together, we do not find in Paine's writings any systematic denunciation of empire or of imperialism. Common sense is not against the British Empire. It doesn't say the British Empire is wrong. Paine is not, he has not conceptualized empire as we have now from the late 19th century. It's not part of his conceptual apparatus. So that's the sort of thing you can do if you start looking historically. What about natural rights theory? I've spoken briefly already about natural rights theory. And to us, natural rights come to center on the most important right of all, I think, for most of us, and that is democracy, the right to vote. And since the Second World War, the right to vote has been generally held by the intelligentsia to be the heart of the matter. Good things can be delivered to peoples around the world only if they all have the right to vote. So universal suffrage is the central doctrine. It's been overtaken more lately, I think, by the rights of women, gender equality, which is now a greater preoccupation. But back then, it was the right to vote. And I trace the historiography of this issue back to another brilliant book by a great scholar, R.R. Palmer from Princeton, who in 1959-64 published a book entitled The Age of the Democratic Revolution, A Political History of Europe and America, 1760 to 1800. This is a great book. The scope, the breadth of his scholarship and the originality of that book are, I think, quite remarkable. And it has seeped into the woodwork, and it has shaped the thought of historians even to the present day. What he essentially says is that there is one movement on both sides of the Atlantic in the late 18th century. It is essentially to do with democracy. Natural rights theory is essentially to do with supporting democracy. Interestingly, though, if you look carefully at that book, the Enlightenment is absent. The Enlightenment is a term of historiographical art that only began to be popular in the 1960s. R.R. Palmer is a figure of the 1950s. He's also very, 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 very American, like the Flintstones, really. This is Flintstones history. Because what he's expressing, he's expressing the ideology of the superpower which has just won the Second World War and has to have an explanation of what it is that it stands for and it's now exporting, and what it is that it was supported by this manufactured genealogy stretching back into the mid-18th century, a genealogy of pioneers, natural rights pioneers, who were eventually people who invented universal suffrage. I have a different view. I argued elsewhere that universal suffrage is actually coined not in 1776 by Americans, not in 1789 by the French. It's coined in England in the 1760s by a collection of dissenting intelligentsia, people like Price and Priestley, of enormous talent, and that it is an offshoot of their theology. Universal suffrage is not called for in the American Revolution in 1776. The Declaration of Independence does not demand it. The franchise is somewhat modified in a variety of colonies, but not in many. And the new American Republic takes as long as the United Kingdom to institute universal suffrage in the early 20th century. The French Revolution, similarly, is not about universal suffrage. It's about many things important. It's war of ideas, but it's not about universal suffrage. So what's the problem? The problem is, it's like I express this as a conflict between universalism and particularism. So in natural rights theory, the problem is that these two languages coexist for a very long time. That's to say, the notion of rights as particular entitlements that your legal system delivers to you and makes real for you, and on the other hand, rights as something that apply to all people everywhere by virtue of their humanity. We tend to think of these two things as fundamentally and logically separate and inconsistent. And you might well think that. If you think that, then you will assume that there must have been, in the 18th century, a point of fracture when the old world gave way to a new world. When the old world of legal privileges and entitlements, privileges granted to you by the state, gave way to a new political culture in which the people affirmed their rights by virtue of their humanity. But the problem with that theory is that there is no such point of rupture, there's no such point of fracture in the 18th century, because all the revolutionaries carried on using both languages. They continued to use both languages. They continued to talk about man or mankind or humanity, a good thing, They also continued to talk about rights and privileges, a good thing. Paine did the same. Paine can write on the same page, the Introduction to Common Sense, about your privileges. And on the same page, he will talk about the universal rights of man. They didn't think it was inconsistent. We think it's inconsistent. They did not think it was inconsistent. So I put it to you, that, and I can quote you, I'm not going to take up time. You've all read the works of Thomas Paine. You know them much better than I do. The phrases will occur to your mind. Look back on it, and you will find that Paine's use of the term privileges, will leap out of the page. He continues to talk into the 1790s about privileges. It's not until he gets to France in the 1790s when privilege in French discourse becomes reified, and the privileged, les privilégiés, it becomes reified. It means something. It means those people over there, the nobles, the privileged. Paine gradually begins to absorb that by the mid-1790s. But it isn't nearly as much reified in English discourse. The English, yeah, they use the word privilege, but they don't say, oh, these people over here, these people are the privileged ones. But it is the case in France, and only gradually does Paine pick up those meanings. Well, I could talk about other areas, the position of women. There's an essay reprinted by Moncure Daniel Conway on the position of women, printed in this same journal, of which Paine was an editorial assistant, the Pennsylvania Journal. It's been known for some time, it's not my discovery, it's been known for some time that this is a translation of the preface to a French monograph on the position of women over many centuries. It is. We don't know who put it in the Pennsylvania Journal. We don't know that Paine put it there. I'm not arguing that Paine plagiarized that any more than I'm arguing that Paine plagiarized Lafayette. I believe Lafayette gave Paine a text fully knowing what Paine would do with it. But Paine, throughout the rest of his writings, ignores the position of women. Even though he knows Mary Wollstonecraft well, he dines at the same table with Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft visits a friend of hers in the Luxembourg prison and probably sees Thomas Paine at the same time. While they're in Paris, they know each other, they're at dinner parties, while Mary Wollstonecraft is writing the first volume of her History of the French Revolution. They have everything to talk about. And Paine never mentions Wollstonecraft's works. He never mentions the position of women in society, just as he never mentions in Rights of Man the position of slaves. Although he says in Rights of Man that this famous lead-in phrase, man has no property in man. A ringing phrase, you could put that on a tea towel. Man has no property in man. And you'd think he would then go on to write at least a sentence, or one would hope a paragraph, saying, and we must apply that principle to slavery too. What an iniquity. Surrounding us, it's in our faces, we're looking at it every day. Why don't we do something? Paine doesn't do that. So the position of women, that sort of thing, that is the sort of thing that we can do to Paine historically. So what are the implications of all this, just to finish in the last 10 minutes of my talk to you? What are the implications of all this for how we conceive of the new world of politics after 1789? My presentation, I think, suggests that natural rights theory was not the key that explained those events. The New American and the New French Republic were not instantiations of natural rights, so securing justice. I work in the United States today. It is a society with many, many, many good points, but you cannot, I think, legitimately analyze it as a society which uniquely instantiates natural rights and delivers them to their people. There are, I learn, international freedom indices, think tanks, that compile league tables of states, giving them marks. I don't know how they come up on these marks for things like the rule of law, the corruption of the judicial system, the free speech, the working of politics, and so on. The United States comes about in the middle. And France comes about the same. That these are not particularly declarative of the triumph of natural rights theory. So what was the role of rights language? If you look at the conventional histories of political thought, you will find there that the history of natural rights is explained always as the history of a series of affirmations. What we most believe in, what we most deeply believe in, what we most profoundly believe in, what are our highest ideals. I don't question that for a moment. I only say that not all of us, all of the time, talk in terms of affirmations, because we're often driven, I know I am, not just by what I believe in, but what I disapprove of. And I put it to you that daily politics tends to be driven, as it is in Britain right at the moment as we debate the referendum, it's driven by two things. Daily politics around the world is driven by distrust and dislike. And revolutions or civil wars are what happen when those two orientations, distrust and dislike, are magnified or extrapolated to become fear and hatred. Why do people kill each other in Syria right now? Because of fear and hatred. Not because they differ on some abstruse points of natural rights theory or even of Islamic theology. Those are markers. But fear and hatred drive revolutions. They drove the American Revolution. They drove the French Revolution. There was no Enlightenment in the 18th century. We are not on the side of the angels. We do not put ourselves on the side of the angels merely by appealing to that historiographical category. And let me go further forward into the 1820s and 30s. These reifications of the 1820s and 30s, these new ideas like liberalism, radicalism, socialism, conservatism, they were not just there. They were not merely there. They were not objectively generated by circumstances. They therefore did not objectively and naturally abolish the dispositions of the old order. We cannot say as historians that natural rights and democracy simply win out in the end. That is a shorthand term, which is now, I think, untenable. Natural rights are rhetorical dressing on claims. Democracy is a word we use to cover a variety of means by which the few govern the many, whether in Westminster or in Brussels. Indeed, we live in a world dominated by war, famine, disease, political tyranny, genocide, religious bigotry, and so on. The deist republics that Thomas Paine expected to emerge failed to emerge. And instead, in our own time, we're seeing a widespread return of religious fundamentalism. Paine would have rejected our world with contempt. Paine now should be living at this time. Let me close with one observation. We can always learn something. I learned something from this august institution. Those of you who have breakfast here would have noticed in the corridor or on the route to the restaurant a display case of extremely grand medals that senior physicians seem to award to each other for their achievements. One of those medals is decorated with a quotation from Francis Bacon. And the quotation is, "Books must follow sciences, not sciences books." That's what I'm trying to do with my work on Thomas Paine. If I get it wrong, please correct me. You are the experts. Thank you.